and thank you all for being here today. It's so great to see everyone in person again. So I'm particularly honored to be with this fine slate of panelists whom I'll introduce here in a second, but before I get started, I want to give a big thanks to my colleague Bill Zaretti for teeing up a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about on this panel. And I think, you know, the innovation perspective that he raised on top of the reliability perspective that was raised on the panel before really leads us to, you know, a good nexus for this panel. So, you know, in regions that have wholesale electricity markets, power sector emissions have declined at a more rapid pace than regions without. Between 2005 and 2021, power sector carbon emissions in regions with wholesale electricity markets were down 35% relative to 27% in regions without. In New England, where nearly 95% of the generation is competitively owned, carbon emissions were down 61% relative to 2005 levels. Put simply, in regions with competitive electricity markets, market participants and private capital can more quickly respond to underlying market fundamentals, including demand for clean energy, than in vertically integrated regions. Today, demand for clean energy continues to grow. Several states in the District of Columbia all have established aggressive clean energy goals, and similarly, voluntary corporate goals at the private sector are also driving new clean energy demand. At the same time, increasing pressure to reduce emissions across other emitting sectors, transportation, buildings, and industrial, could dramatically increase electricity demand through mid-century. So in many ways, we have a tale of two demands: increased demand for clean energy and increased demand for electricity generally. Should today's demand for clean energy materialize, the grid will look dramatically different than it does today. An increase in use-limited and variable resources will create new operational needs and undoubtedly force a rethink, as we've heard this morning, of system planning. Couple that with the demand for more electricity, the grid will be even more critical to meeting societal needs reliably and affordably than it already is. So fundamentally, in order to maintain a reliable and affordable grid and ensure a just transition, it's our view that we must utilize competition. The question becomes then, how do we best do that? And that's why you're all here. So with that, I want to introduce my panelists. Starting to my left, we've got Stephen Gallagher, who is the Chief Commercial Officer for Brookfield Renewable U.S. operations. Immediately next to him, Gordon Van Welie, the President and CEO of ISO New England. And then Arne Olson, who's the Senior Partner at Energy and Environmental Economics, or E3. And then Jill Davies, Senior Vice President of Trading for Shell Energy Americas. And all the way down on my far end is John Moore, who's a Senior Attorney and Director for the Sustainable FERC Project. So thank you all for being here today. And so with that, I think we can jump in. And so as we've already identified, competitive electricity markets have a strong track record for integrating resources that have led to emissions reduction. The key question facing us today is how those markets can continue to reliably integrate the next wave of resources needed to meet demand for clean energy, particularly given the intermittent and use-limited nature of those resources. So Gordon, I'm going to start with you and would welcome others' thoughts on this, but you've spoken recently about your view of what the four pillars are for a successful clean energy transition. Can you talk a little bit about that, and in particular, the role you see for competitive markets in that process?
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. Well, it's great to see everybody. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the question. So I've started talking about that recently to try and pick up on the point that Devin made actually in the first panel around how do you educate people. So it's striking to me that the new theme for the moment, I think, with EPSA is reliability is job number one. I've always viewed that as our job at the ISO as well. So that theme resonates with me. The problem is how to have a conversation about reliability and have people actually listen to you. And because I recognize that certainly in our region, often when we say the word reliability, it gets interpreted as we're somehow resistant to the clean energy transition. And so I think we have to have a holistic conversation, and hence the four pillars. And the four pillars was my engineering-oriented way of trying to describe what has to be done in order to have a successful clean energy transition. And the successful clean energy transition, in my view, embodies reliability, because society is not going to be prepared to have electricity rationed for extended periods of time. We see the outcomes and the violent reactions. So we make it very complicated because we all live in this industry and it is a complicated industry, but really when you think about the grid, it's fairly simple. It's a collection of wires and a bunch of devices for converting energy inputs into electricity outputs. And it's as simple as that. And if our wholesale market structures and the various regulatory processes we have around that structure don't give us the 4 pillars of equal strength, something's going to break down and we're going to have adverse outcomes. So the 4 pillars really are, in the context of moving us into a world where we depend on renewable energy, we obviously need lots more devices that can convert sunshine and wind into electricity, right? So that's what the states are primarily focused on. But the problem is you can't just focus on that silo to the exclusion of everything else. You need transmission. And you hear people talking about that, and it's hard to get transmission built, but we're never going to scale the system up if we don't build the transmission. We need a robust structure, a robust market structure for paying for the balancing resources. And then finally, the thing that I've sort of introduced and deliberately decoupled from the generation component here, the balancing resource component, is the need for energy adequacy. We need some kind of energy reserve in the system. And I came to that really through, how do I explain this to lay people in terms of what's needed in order to ensure reliability? And if you're going to run a system where the bulk of the energy is going to come from the sun and the wind, and is inherently unpredictable, you've got to have some other energy source that's stable to be able to support that. And you, of course, have to run it through some generators to produce electricity, but it has to be stabilized. And I think in New England, the big problem we've got is all of it's unstable, with a few minor exceptions. And so that's a big problem. So, your question, Brian, as to, how do we apply markets to all of this? There are markets in the form of markets that utilize uniform clearing price auctions and marginal pricing, and I think those apply very well to attracting the capital needed to provide the balancing resources. And I think they can also be modified to attract the renewable technologies as well. And we'll talk more about that on this panel in terms of how do you get the environmental objective into the market. Most economists will tell you if you don't put the externalities into the market design and you don't take into account the supply side frictions, your market's not going to work. And I think we see the stresses and strains as a result of that. So when I look at those 4 pillars, at the moment I grade them in New England with a traffic light symbol. So I look at renewables and I say it's a yellow or an orange, an amber, because we're not going fast enough to meet the goals of the region. On the transmission side, I give it a green for now because we've invested a lot in the transmission system and it's allowed a lot of turnover in the fleet, and I think we're well positioned to build on what has already been invested. It could easily become an amber over time in terms of achieving the renewable, the clean energy transition. With regard to the wholesale market structure, I think it's an amber, and it could be trending towards a red in the next decade if we don't make some fixes to the wholesale market structure. And we've got a whole series of improvements that we're planning to act upon. But I think one of the big improvements in the long run is in pricing the environmental objective into the market as well. And then finally, I would say on the energy adequacy side of things, it's a red. So you heard Jim Robb say it, and I've been very clear about it. I think we are one of the more vulnerable regions in the country because of that issue. And it may be the very thing that creates, the instability that we all fear with regard to the markets surviving in the long run. And so I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us, a lot of hard work ahead of us. There are no easy fixes here, and we're going to have to take these improvements one by one and push them through the system. And the thing that worries me is we have a very polarized, divisive system, all the way from our stakeholder process all the way up to the federal regulator. So I'd be interested to hear my panelists' thoughts about how we can work together to engineer a successful clean energy transition.
Great, thanks, Gordon. And Arne, I know you've had some thoughts on the pillar framework as well. So I'm kind of curious your reaction to the way Gordon has teed up the pillars and sort of how we can use that framework to start moving forward based on some of the work that you've done in the past.
Well, at E3, we've used the pillars in a somewhat different way. And so I'm not going to immediately confuse everybody by telling you what our 4 pillars are. They're different. Maybe we can come back to that towards the end of this question or towards the end of the panel. They're more economy-wide related to decarbonization. But I really like the way that Gordon put the 4 pillars for the electricity system only. I'm interested in your grades. They may be very New England specific. So maybe I'll throw out some grades, maybe from a more national or maybe more from a Western perspective.
They are New England grades.
Good, okay. Want to get that clear. Which test are you actually grading? It's not for the whole class. Okay, but how are we doing in the rest of the country? Seems to me for zero carbon resources, I would give that a green. I think we've had enormous success in developing the technologies, especially with the wind and solar resources now coming along the batteries. Geothermal is a little behind, but I think we've been enormously successful in driving down the cost of those technologies, making them really risk-free investments almost from an operational perspective, if you can get them onto the grid, and if you can understand what your revenue streams are. So there's enormous potential to develop lots and lots more of those resources and really displace gas and reduce a lot of carbon emissions in the very near term. So I would give that a green. Transmission, I would almost give it a red, or maybe it's a yellow, but I think intuitively we all understand that there's going to be a real need for transmission nationwide to deal with load resource diversity, to bring renewables from remote locations where the high quality resources exist to the coastal load centers that are hard to get to. And I think we're way behind on that. In terms of the capacity markets, the structure is there. And I think we'll talk a lot about how those need to be modified, all the tweaks that we can make to them, and there are many that need to be made. But the structure is largely there, I think, to continue to incent the types of investments that we've already seen. And we've seen so much evidence for how successful they've been at driving investment in reliability resources. And then I guess on the energy adequacy question, maybe that's an incomplete. We've only really just begun to understand the nature of that challenge and how it relates to the capacity challenge.
Perhaps you have, but New England has been grappling with this issue for 2 decades. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, very good. So.
Thanks, Arne. Anyone else on the panel have any reactions to that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems, like the market design that we have now was really intended to promote competition and drive down price for consumers. And now we have a different challenge. In the past, no one cared where their energy was coming from. Now it's extremely important. And we've talked about technology a little bit so far today. And I bet you probably a lot of people in this room know how many steps they took, what their heart rate is, how many hours of sleep they got. Everyone is so in tune. Consumers are so in tune and have so much access to energy now. They care about supply chain. They care about who's making the goods, where the goods are coming from. So everything has changed in our market. Gordon was talking about education. A big passion of mine is around the role that natural gas will play in the energy transition. And I'm extremely frustrated about the kind of demonization of fossil fuels, and in particular of gas, when we really need something that we can rely on when there is no hydro and no wind and no sun. But the challenge is really how to make people understand that when they simply won't accept a lack of power in their homes, and we don't want to get to the point where we're rationing power and asking our industries to turn off. So, I mean, I think the people that really need the recognition and the help and the reward is really at the RTOs and the ISOs. The staff that is grappling with this challenge every day to try to keep the system balanced, and it's only going to get worse. We've talked about that We've already had 2 major weather events with the heat dome in California and with the Texas weather event last February. Managing a system when your base load has gone away and the energy sources that you have are now variable and they might not even be in the right place. I think that what we really need now is innovation and technology to step in to help us do a better job of forecasting. The role of planning, I think, is going to be critical going forward to understand, how cities will grow, where will the load be, how will we stress test our systems with climate change. The stress test of the past, maybe, plus or minus 10%, is ludicrous going forward with some of the energy demands that we've seen in these extreme weather events.
Thanks, Jill. And real quick, John, I think that really gets back to 2 points, right? The energy security pillar, right? And your point about gas and, Arne's work in particular has looked at the need for firm resources well into the future. But it also, I think on the education point, really gets back to what Gordon mentioned at the outset, right? Which is oftentimes this sort of focus on reliability is equated to a resistance to the transition. And that, I think, just underscores the need for sort of the education perspective. So thank you. John?
Sure. I want to say first that the Sustainable FERC Project and our members strongly support markets, and we believe in competition. That's why we support markets in the West, the development of wholesale organized markets in the Southeast, and whatnot. And I just want to get that out on the table first of all. We really do believe in them. I think that Gordon's beginning of the discussion around framing this around the electricity problem, an engineering issue, is spot on. We've got more diverse resources now. We've all heard the reasons why the grid is changing significantly, and I certainly agree in this general concept of breaking the types of resources we have on the grid into those variable energy resources, the weather-dependent resources, the fast burst types of resources, and also the firm resources. And I think there's a role for markets in all 3 sets of those resources. I especially think that's true for the firm resources and for the fast burst resources. And there are really problems with market access for both of them now, especially on the fast burst resources, which I think is going to require more state involvement to get more of the state jurisdictional DERs and demand response programs really synthesized and a little bit of more ease in getting those into the market, or query whether or not more of those just should stay in the background and be forecasted against load. I don't know. I do think that the transmission is a huge piece of it, especially in thinking of transmission more as an element of this resource adequacy. We think you're going to need at least 3 times as much transmission capability and capacity as we do now. And that transmission needs to be, we need to start thinking of the transmission as one of the resources to help meet those days when wind and solar output are low. So ultimately, I think, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this a little bit further down the line, for those fast burst resources and certainly for the firm resources, that is a critical role for the RTOs to play and to make sure there's resource neutrality in the way you design those markets and that the attributes of those markets are well set and don't discriminate or preference one set of resources or the other.
Steve?
Just a very small piece, just picking up on the transmission side. So just on that, I suppose, how critical it is in the build-out. One of the interesting pieces that we've been approached with, I've been approached over the last 6 months, is some of our larger customers are coming to us now and asking, like we have an infrastructure business, so we own private transmission and we invest in transmission. Some of the larger customers, seeing these constraints and seeing the level of investment that's needed, are approaching us and asking, are there ways that we can work together, or we can work together in terms of moving this forward and developing it. So I think, again, it's not just on our side, on the generator side, but the customers, particularly the more sophisticated customers who are increasing significant amount of load in all of our regions, are asking. This is front and foremost on their mind.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it's a good segue kind of as we dig into these pillars, if you will. And I think the first one and this, kind of tee this up for you as really a developer of those new resources, to meet that growing demand for clean energy. Kind of curious from your perspective, we've seen around the country a lot of success in sort of competitive, mechanisms to procure clean energy resources at low cost. So can you talk a little bit about, how your organization's views and your core focus both in the intermediate and near term as you look to both develop those new resources, but also retain the existing ones that you have?
And so I think I'll talk about the core focus first. So look, fundamentally, the reason why we're sitting here today is, look, climate change is the biggest risk that we face, both from an economy and also just facing the world. So with that, our focus, short, medium, and long term, is on the transition to a net zero economy. That's our primary focus. Look, we understand that that's not going to happen overnight. It's a multi-decade approach. But just to put a little framework in terms of the sheer size of this, like based on our estimates, if you lay out all the plans that both public and private sector have laid out in terms of decarbonization, by 2050, that's $150 trillion of investment. That's trillion. So that's a significant amount of capital that needs to be deployed. So that, again, that's not just going to fall on the public sector. It needs a significant amount of investment from the private sector. So we see firms like ourselves, like Brookfield, we see us with our operation capabilities, the fact our global reach, our willingness to deploy capital to work on that transition. I think that's our core focus. So on that, what are we doing about it? So we're just about to close the first largest fund of its type, called the Brookfield Global Transition Fund. It's a $15 billion fund targeted at the transition to net zero. That's $15 billion of equity. So by the time you leverage that up, you're talking probably $60-70 billion plus that we need to deploy into this landscape. So again, there's a couple of areas for us that are focused for that fund and some of the opportunities. So like this is going to be the largest commercial opportunity of our lifetime that we see. For this fund, we're targeting three main areas. The first is, as we've talked about, it's the business that we've been in for over 30 years, which is just developing, owning and operating new renewable generation. I think that's the piece that's been consistent. We've seen the growth has started to accelerate, and there's going to be significant amount of capital required just to continue to keep up with demand. We're seeing the demand coming on the corporate side, and fundamentally we're struggling to keep up on the supply side. So there's a significant amount of capital need there. The second piece, which is when we start to get a little bit outside of the normal realm, it's working with large industrial customers. So again, understanding that everyone isn't a bleeding edge tech company with extremely high margins and strong cash flow generation. Looking at the industrial landscape, so the cement, steel, chemical manufacturers, and it's working with those businesses where we not only provide the renewable supply, so we build renewable, but we also work with them and provide capital to fund their transition. So again, that's going to take time. It's not done overnight. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It can start with the simple piece of just what's doing the energy efficiency audit, plus the renewable supply, all the way through to we provide capital now to industry to build new manufacturing. So to put in place new manufacturing processes that decarbonize, so switching from gas to electricity and have electricity backed by renewables. So that's the first two. And then the third one is really working with electricity generators. So again, helping generators move from coal to gas and gas to renewables. So gas to solar, gas to wind, gas to hydrogen over time. I think the critical piece there is this is not going to happen. As I said, this is not going to happen overnight. So it's from a practical point of view, it just can't. we can't, I think you can transition the economy to fully green quickly. You have to understand all the various different pockets. So for us, it's working with everybody, working within the confines of their own goals, their own budgetary constraints, and playing across we got it the 50 shades of green, from coal all the way to the hydrogen on the spectrum. So that's the area where we're kind of really focused now, and that's the transition. So I'd say that's our primary focus. So we've gone from, in our US business, we've gone from just purely on the renewable supply development now to looking at the broader solution that we can provide towards the decarbonisation.
And maybe just a quick follow-up, and then I'm interested in the panel's views on this. From your seat, what do you see as one of the biggest obstacles to the continued investment in what you're doing? I mean, clearly the private capital is there, the demand is there. So from your seat looking forward, what do you see as sort of that primary obstacle?
This is not going to come as a shock to anybody in this room, but I would say, look, fundamentally, when you're talking about the quantums of capital that we need to deploy, I'd say just regulatory stability. So again, look, when you're looking to make these investments, again, you're looking for a risk-adjusted return, but just having a stable framework, a stable market framework within which to work. Capital is fungible, so it can move from geography to geography. But here, when you're looking to attract and you're looking to deploy it and you're looking to build out these projects, just knowing what the landscape is in front of you and being able to, I can look and quantify the linear risks. You can adjust your pricing, you can look at your assumptions. But when it comes to trying to, we just can't take the binary risk outcomes. I think that's it. It's not reinventing the wheel per se. I would say just a stable regulatory environment that gives you a clean pathway so you can assess the investment opportunity. Like some of the projects we're doing, so the projects we're looking at, again, 3, 5, 7-year lead times. So trying to make a decision today on not knowing what the environment's going to look like in 3 or 5 years' time when you come to bring the project online, that is a hurdle for capital investment.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I feel like society in general is outside of this room, I think society in general is really underestimating the size and the scale of the problem and how long it'll take to make progress. It's a fact that emissions are lower now than they were 5 years ago, or 10 or 15 or 20. So we're going in the right direction. I think the key challenge is, can we achieve enough in line with society's expectations of their sense of urgency? Recognizing that also people are not willing to compromise. Oftentimes, they don't want pipelines built where they live. They don't want to look out the windows and see wind farms. It's a huge decision to understand where to place these renewables because they take so much land. The transmission burden is very, very high. It's extremely expensive. Really the obstacles I see is around the education and the pace of change that we have to realize as an industry. And it's really a man-made problem that we've in response to society's sense of urgency, we've been retiring at such a pace, the baseload generation, that we've created this problem for ourselves that we now have to resolve. And we have to understand that it's not a one-for-one transference. If you retire, a coal plant or a gas-fired generation plant, you can't just replace it with one solar farm or one wind farm. You need at orders of magnitude greater, megawatts, and you also need the geographical diversification. And we have to reorient the grid away from the legacy assets that are either retired now or will soon be retired. If you look at, if every company and every country looks at the energy that they're buying and simply targets on an orderly fashion the heaviest emitting sources and work your way down. That seems like a logical way to do it, but even that requires a lot of investment. So I think it's very helpful to actually, from a planning perspective, spend a lot of time, with the ISOs and the RTOs to understand, what do they need and what is causing them problems. And I think that, the states really have to start cooperating better, because what we saw in California with the heat dome is that they didn't have the ability to share and move power within the states to help each other in that region. So I think coordination between states is going to be increasingly important. Having a portfolio of energy sources is going to be key, with a lot of diversification, a lot of redundancy, and a lot of cooperation between the states. And then, there's still a lot we can do even to lower the emissions across value chain, in particular with co-locating, bundling, that would save on resources of money and land, bundling, batteries with solar, bundling storage with wind, locating carbon capture besides LNG liquefaction facilities or at the wellhead. There's a lot of work that we can still do with fuel switching and bundling to further have efficiencies and also keep lowering the emissions.
Gordon.
Yeah, I'm struck by your comment with regard to regulatory certainty, and that's a live conversation within New England at the moment, and around how do you attract all the new renewables into the marketplace, and do we continue on the path that we're on, which has been essentially sort of state by state power purchase agreements really driven by the legislature. So we were asked to study this a year or so back, and we've just released a report called the Pathways Report that looks at the status quo. It looks at net carbon pricing, something called the forward clean energy market, and then a hybrid of net carbon pricing in the forward clean energy market. So what's interesting about that study is it shows the status quo is by far the most expensive path forward and the most inefficient as well. It creates all kinds of adverse impacts in the electricity markets. It creates churn with regard to storage. You end up having more storage deployed in order to allow renewables to capture various clean energy attributes. And so an inefficient build out of storage, as an example. And so, interestingly enough, net carbon pricing is the most efficient way of doing this. I don't know that there's a political tolerance to place all the bets on carbon pricing in England, is the problem. And so my instinct is we may be asked to study some form of hybrid, which was explicitly injected into the study process by some of the New England states. Because this is this interesting realization that now has occurred, which is what I said earlier on about having the wholesale markets trend from amber to red has to do with one of the artifacts in that study, which shows that we eventually, in the space of a decade or so, start driving the region into average negative LMPs. That's going to wreck the markets if that's what happens, and it's not going to work. It'll require a massive restructuring of the market. I agree with Arne that the elements of the market design we have in place today are the right elements. The problem is how do you make them work? And so I think there's a recognition that we can't go further in terms of losing the nuclear capacity in New England. If you speak to any of the owners of the existing renewables, you being one of them, in New England, they would say, we can't survive on negative LMPs either. So as the states grapple with that reality, I think there's some empathy starting to develop towards perhaps we need to put a carbon price into the electricity markets. It's probably not the right place to do it. The right place to do it is in RGGI or in some national scheme, but both of those are not really politically feasible at this point. So the next best is to put it into the ISO markets, and we're going to need to have the states tell us what number they want. But I think you could also reverse engineer a number which says what's the number you need to put into the energy dispatch in order to maintain reliability, pay for the nukes, pay for the existing renewables, give a bigger incentive to the combined cycle owners to slowly start decarbonizing their fuel source. So I think there's all kinds of goodness that comes out of that. And then the question is, well, should one go so far as to put the full decarbonization objective into the wholesale electricity market or not? And I just mentioned a moment ago, it's probably politically not feasible. So then you're left with this additional gap that you need to close in order to drive investment in additional renewables. And there's another interesting tension that's developed in New England, which is the transmission owners don't like the idea of all these PPAs being on their balance sheet. So that is a reality that the region has to grapple with as well, and hence the appetite, I think, for other mechanisms like the For Clean Energy Market. So we're at a very interesting juncture in this conversation in New England. And then the other companion piece to this is the states asked us to do a transmission plan, to sketch out what the transmission system should look like by 2050 in order to decarbonize. And it's a ginormous task. I mean, we've just released a study that shows by 2050, our existing system will, 50% of the lines in New England will be overloaded. And it's not surprising. I mean, we have to, at the moment, our winter peak is 22,000 megawatts. The 2050 plan shows that we'll be close to 60 gigawatts. So you've got to scale the system up. You've got to at least double or treble its ability to meet the peak demand. So it should be no surprise that we're going to need massive amounts of investment in the transmission system. And we're not even looking at what has to happen at the distribution level, right? And you can't just scale the transmission system up and think that somehow magically we're going to microwave the energy to everybody in New England. It's going to have to be carried through the distribution system. So there's many hundreds of billions of dollars, I think, of investment required on the transmission end. And so I think the study process is starting to illuminate these issues, which I hope will lead to ultimately actions that can be taken that will give you the regulatory certainty that you seek.
John.
So a lot of richness in what's just been said, I think, and whether or not it's LMP, negative LMPs, and what to do about that, or the carbon price. And I just want to note, I recall, was it a little over a year ago, Vistra and others were really doing a pretty good job of trying to get that elevated to FERC to take a look at a carbon price set by the states that could be accepted by FERC. We came very close to formally supporting it, and still think that has some legs, possibility, certainly. I wanted to amplify just two things Jill said. We don't agree on everything, I'm sure, but two things she said I think are critically important. One, the education piece. I think we all, I know Brian, your team, others probably are stunned on a near daily basis over the real incomplete level of understanding that policymakers, regulators, legislators all have about how the grid works and what the implications are for the future, having made at a state level, for example, commitments, serious clean energy commitments in lots of respects, and then not knowing what that ultimately means for consumers and the environment. I think I've lost, there we go. What's the real price? It's very hard for anyone to get a number around a price, for example. No one knows what $1 billion feels like unless you're a developer. And, the people in the room here have a much better grasp of that than regulators and policymakers. Believe me, I see this every day. So I think the education piece is important, and then also just the state cooperation. There has to be more state cooperation, whether or not it's in the form of a carbon price or in recognizing the value of transmission to help meet. Sounds okay, right? To help meet state renewable energy and other goals, along with resource adequacy. I know this group is mostly interested in the eastern markets, but issues like capacity accreditation and resource adequacy are just going to become more and more important in MISO and SPP and other new regions in the future as there's more and more of these resources are differently correlated, they're outside of state boundaries, et cetera. So I think states working together, simplifying products, simplifying the number of local mandates, looking to the markets to meet more of the firm resource needs, understanding the value in that. that's got to be a change. And I live in Illinois, believe me. I mean, it's a tale of two markets. It's a crazy political system in many respects down in Springfield, and it's hard going sometimes.
Yeah, Arne?
I'd just like to make sure that nobody missed what Stephen said at the very beginning. Can you repeat that number again?
150 trillion.
Yeah.
With a T,
We
right?
put it on the screen.
150.
My Irish accent, I know, mightn't have been clear, but it's a significant amount of capital. So again,
Indeed.
it boggles the mind.
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure that at some point in the panel today that we highlighted the really critical role of this sector in helping to meet our economy-wide net zero goals, not just in cleaning up our own house, but the entire economy, electrifying end uses, doubling our peak load, as Gordon said. So we have to get this right. And literally the fate of the world depends on us getting this right. It's an enormous job that we have ahead of us. We have to make sure that our systems are well set up, our engineering is done well, our financing is done well, we have financially healthy companies. We all need to be pushed together in the same direction. And one of the elements of the economy-wide plan is electrification of end uses that currently use fossil fuels in other sectors. It's really consumer uptake of electrified technologies, electric cars, electric heat pumps, and others. And in order for that to happen, we have to do all of this, $150 trillion worth of investment, while keeping our electric rates reasonable, so that it's an attractive proposition for consumers to adopt these new technologies. So that's the needle that we have to thread. And I would suggest that we really have to be mindful of the bigger challenge as we think through all of the various ways to implement clean energy and make sure that we're doing that as absolutely efficiently as we can, and with our eye directly on the bottom line and what it means for consumers. Because if we don't, it's not just that it's a little bit more expensive. We don't make our environmental goals.
It's enough to make me a Federalist.
Any additional responses to that? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that I mean, none of us want to talk about the problems and not offer solutions. So I think what would be really, really helpful is if we could see more standardization of products. We've talked about the carbon price. I mean, clearly, I think there's unanimous agreement with people who are in the market that a national product would be ideal. But it is always a challenge when states have different preferences and different voters and priorities. I always find that sometimes there's a lot of noise around the regulatory environment. Oftentimes the rules are not so easy to understand. So if the rules could be a little bit more simple, that would be extremely helpful. I hear from customers all the time that they have to hire, consultants and independent, law firms to help them interpret the rules. That's obviously a barrier to business. Liquidity seems to be going in one direction, which is not getting better. Previous panels have talked about developers, and they're the ones. If we can give them the right investment climate, they're the ones that are going to make those investments. But not all developers are created equal. We've seen several of them go bankrupt. Again, feedback from the customers is they literally don't know if the developers are going to be in business in 15 years' time. So they pause before they sign up for those long-term projects for that reason. And then on the sales side, we need to make sure that we keep the competition in the retail sector so that people can access the customers, because what you buy, you have to sell.
Yeah.
I was going to pick up on one point, just on the customer side, and I think one of your opening comments, I suppose, about the low pricing environment that we've seen in the last couple of years. Now it's started to increase again, just on the PPAs. But speaking to the customers, and today we're starting to see some developers come back, or a lot of developers come back to the customers and look to renegotiate these contracts because they're now upside down, they're underwater. And in some extreme cases, they're just walking away from the security deposits. So that's what's actively happening in the market today, again, as we move through this. So again, it makes that environment for investment much more difficult. In speaking to the customers, there is the piece that, again, not all customers are created equal, so some are very sophisticated, but others are not, and they can get scared away by some of the complexities. So hiring consultants, they can step back, but across the board, what we're hearing from customers right now is like it's laid out. They have their ESG mandates laid out. They have their goals to meet. What they need is assurance on execution. So they are willing to pay a premium to make sure, in their contract price, to make sure that you can deliver and execute on time. Because right now, that's not happening. So in terms of the environment where, unfortunately, you have some situations or in some markets where there's the race to the bottom in terms of pricing. What we've seen now is that go full circle and come back on us. And these contracts are starting to blow up.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think, so maybe just to go a little bit higher level and, hit on a lot of themes that we've discussed both on this panel, but also the prior panels. I mean, we opened this panel with the notion that competitive markets have driven emissions reductions more successfully than regions that aren't competitive. So, I think that the key question, is how do we, continue to leverage those market forces and the RTOs, given all of these competing demands out there so that we really do maximize the benefits that those RTOs and competition provide. And there's been a lot of discussion about, carbon pricing being, the preferred path forward, the easiest to implement. But, we still haven't found the solution and we have a near-term problem. So I'm kind of curious, and this is, I recognize a $64 million question, but what is the role of the RTO going forward in this context, recognizing that you've got energy security concerns to balance with reliability objectives, to balance with these growing demands for clean energy. So I'm just kind of curious in the panel's thoughts on that. And John, I kind of want to start with you. I mean, what is the right balance to make sure that we're extracting the most out of those competitive market mechanisms, given all of these demands that are being placed on the markets?
Right. Well, I think at least personally speaking, I like some combination of the RTO role for meeting the reliability and reliability needs, coupled with that kind of the Brattle type FCEM clean energy market, some sort of a centralized clean energy market to help consolidate some of the differing state and corporate customer and other requirements for procuring clean energy. So I think there's some sort of a balance where the reliability function morphs from the capacity market we have today to something like a capabilities market to address some of the differing types of needs we're going to have with meeting much more than just a traditional, peak load day with different types of resources, use limited, weather dependent, other type, an enormous amount of distributed energy resources on the grid. So I just can't see the RTO not being an important part of that need to ensure reliability. And I think the states who are driving so much of the generation decisions are going to see that. And then just, generally speaking, transparency, accessibility, resource neutrality, those are the types of elements I think I've mentioned a little bit already that are important. In return, I think the states are going to have to recognize the value of something like a centralized clean energy market, and you're going to have to just cut the number of products a little bit. Even in New England, there's so many different clean energy mandates, types of requirements, and they're not going to work in any sort of a centralized fashion. And it's fine when they're under 10%, 20% of resources. But when you get to the levels that now states have committed to in the New York CLCPA, in California, and I think in Illinois, you're going to need, there's going to have to be some consolidation along, and the states are going to see, I think, to persuade the states, their customers, utility regulators who answer to the consumers for both cost and reliability, the values of the organized markets in that regard. So all important. And I think we'll get to the clean energy transition we need to get to more quickly and more reliably.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind jumping in there. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we did with EPSA last year on scaling markets for the clean energy transition. There's a paper out there. You can just Google that if you haven't seen it, if you're interested. We address some of these issues around how our existing wholesale markets might need to transform. What's the role of the RTO? What's the role of a forward clean energy market, et cetera, in doing this? I think what we find is that, first of all, we want to recognize the role that competitive markets has already played in achieving carbon reductions through more efficient dispatch, the role that it plays in allowing small transmission-dependent entities to access large and diverse transmission networks for balancing renewables, for accessing remote renewables. Every utility that connects to PJM is better off in some ways than the utilities in the West that are each managing their own system and really restricted to resources that can connect to their own transmission system, maybe one neighboring system over. So that we need to recognize that important role that those markets play. But at the same time, what we have with our current system, with lack of federal leadership, is kind of 1,000 flowers blooming, right? We have all of these individualized, it's hodgepodge, I guess was the word that came up on the previous panel, of clean energy standards, RPS standards, you have ESGs, you have Google doing 24/7, you have all these interesting ideas, and they're all great. It's good to have that kind of innovation, but those aren't going to scale to 85, 90, 95% clean energy, which is where we need to get to, in very short order. So we need something that scales. I've got a 10-minute speech about the benefits of carbon pricing, which I left on the table over there. Won't go into that. We can all agree on that. We can probably also agree that that's not on the table for this Congress, this administration. So what's our next best? But I think it's still useful to hold that up as a benchmark and think about the characteristics that mechanism has, right? And it was talked about earlier. What does it have? It's universal, right? Carbon is a global problem. It's not a ISO New England problem. It's not a PJM problem. It's a global problem. We need to have a global price signal that reflects the value of reducing carbon emissions. It's tradable across multiple sectors. It's not just in the electric sector. It's transportation, it's housing, it's industry. We can't replicate all of those things with the second best mechanism in the electric sector. We might be able to replicate some of them. The mechanism that we came up with is a bilateral clean energy market. And we like that better than an organized FCEM because an organized FCEM seems to be defined around one system, one ISO. And again, this is it's a global problem. There's no reason why PJM should have a separate price for a clean energy attribute than ISO New England should or that CAISO should. Really, the value of reducing carbon everywhere should and ought to be the same. So, which isn't to say that we don't see a benefit in something like an FCEM, because what it does do is it drives the standardization of the clean energy attribute, which is what you really need to get to scale. You really need that to be a standardized, commoditized, tradable product. But it's not a product that's a function of an RTO's role as a grid operator. It's really a societal value that the RTO is reflecting in its markets. And a carbon price is the most direct way to do that right into the dispatch. In the absence of that, an FCM is an interesting idea. It doesn't need to be run by the ISO. It can be run by somebody else. If it's useful to have an auction, it doesn't need to be somebody with a FERC tariff. It doesn't need to be rolled in. And in fact, I think there's some danger in trying to roll this in to the core roles that the market operator plays, which are to procure the energy and the grid services and the capacity that the grid needs. The grid doesn't care if the resources are clean or dirty that provide the services that customers need. Society cares about that, so we need to reflect the societal perspective. But it's not necessarily the RTO's role, and it's dangerous, I think, to try to wrap that too tightly in to its role of operating an efficient and reliable grid.
I agree with that.
Anyone else?
I'd agree with that. I just don't know if that's the way it's going to play out. So, I think you're right, and there are mechanisms. There are state-authorized mechanisms for pricing carbon, and so you have to ask yourself the question: why aren't they being utilized? And there's a set of complicated reasons for that, and then the issue becomes: you're also right that there shouldn't be evaluation in New England around clean energy attributes that's different to PJM. It may be a necessary step in the evolution to get to the end state that you describe. Because, John's point, to standardize, and your point, to standardize what we have already, that might be the necessary first step, and then you live that way for a decade, and then you throw it away and you go to the next step. So it may not be feasible to get to the end state without going through such an evolutionary process.
In my view, it's absolutely like an iterative process like that. And development of those earlier steps in a regional basis might provide the basis for something more national. So we'll see.
Great. Well, with that, we are at time. So thank you all so much for taking the time with us. And just everyone, please join me in thanking our panel today. So.